Hello, this is Charles Scoville, your Golden Harvest Great Lakes area agronomist, and welcome back for another edition of the Golden Harvest Agronomy in Action podcast. Now, today is August the 21st, and it's been a very busy week. On Tuesday, we had our regional Agronomy in Action experience plot event. It was down in that Waldron, Michigan area at Nathan Baker's family farm. There were over 150 attendees, all learning about agronomy and corn innovation from Golden Harvest and soybean technology advancements, as well as seed care and crop protection initiatives, from our Syngenta counterparts. It was just a great day filled with great conversations, great weather, and as always, great food. Now, I also had the chance to walk fields in northern Indiana this week, as well as start to recover from last week's county fair experience. Now, this week on the podcast, let's plan on talking about our first update on growing degree day accumulation. Are we ahead? Are we behind? And secondly, I want to take you through a number of observations and calls received this week about the developing crop across Michigan and northern Indiana. So, grab your cup of coffee and let's talk agronomy. Now, first off, I've been getting lots of questions lately about if we are ahead or behind in heat units this year. So for my hardcore listeners, that it's usually about this time of the year that I start tracking, and reporting those numbers to you every week. And this seems like as good as any week to get us started. So according to the data from the MSU Enviro weather site, here are the numbers. If we look at the East Lansing area, we're at 1,960 heat units. So what does that mean? Well, that's 46 units behind last year, but 16 units ahead of the 6-year average. If we go way down to southwest Michigan in that Constantine area at 2,074 heat units, that puts us 50 units behind last year and 11 units behind the 6-year average. If we go down southeast Michigan in that Deerfield, Blissfield area at 2072 heat units, we're only 17 units behind last year, but we're 13 units ahead of the 6-year average. Well, if we go up north to that Mount Pleasant area at 1940 heat units, that puts us 77 heat units behind last year and 17 heat units behind the 6-year average. And finally, go up to the top of the thumb there in the Pigeon area at 1802 heat units. Well, that's actually 4 heat units ahead of last year, but 15 heat units behind the 6-year average. So with us averaging an accumulation, let's say, of about 22 heat units a day lately, you can see that we are within about just one actual day of the 6-year average across the entire geography. But in general, we are a little behind last year's numbers, across the board. And, we're as many as an actual 3 days behind last year, for instance, in Mount Pleasant. Now, as for the calls and observations this week, I first wanted to highlight the importance of scouting from inside the field and not just from the roadside. Now, while in northern Indiana, I was asked to look at some yellow soybeans. Now, the customer said that he thought he might have spider mites. Now, with all the rain in northern Indiana lately, I would have truly been very surprised to find spider mites there, but, we did need to determine the cause of these yellow beans. So upon walking into the field, it was quickly obvious by the top leaves showing that kind of green center and yellow margins around the outside of the leaf surface that we were actually dealing with potash deficiency there. Now, with the cost of potash this past year, I am seeing more and more fields that, maybe didn't get the fertilizer it needed, and now we're paying the real price of fertility. Now, he wanted me to check some other fields as well, and, all of those showed the same symptomology. But, with this in mind, I am seeing a lot of actual spider mite damage still occurring in our drier parts of the geography. Those bronze patches in the soybean fields, often, but not always near the edges. Boy, they're still prevalent and they're still taking yield away every day. I just had a call from a customer in Gratiot County Thursday where, they were pulling plants, shaking them on the white surfaces, and still finding live mites. Now, in these cases where you're scouting and you're finding live mites, we need to get these guys under control and fast. The application of a miticide it's critical to keeping those mites from sucking our plants dry, and yes, because we're just at that most critical yield accumulation time of the year right now. The other big yellow soybean things to be looking for, of course, right now, is those issues that maybe are causing that interveinal chlorosis, such as, sudden death syndrome, brown stem rot, red crown rot, and, even manganese deficiency. So, as always, if you need help distinguishing between these issues, just, give me or your Golden Harvest sales rep a call, and we'll be happy to go out and walk those fields with you right away. Now, I've also gotten multiple questions this week on whether or not it's too late to apply fungicides, both the corn and the soybeans. Now, this is always a difficult question because the real answer to whether or not there'll be a positive return on investment in these situations is, it depends. Now, if we're talking corn, we believe as an industry that the best ROI remains kind of at that R1 growth timing. Now, there continues to be debate on tassel emergence versus green silk versus brown silk, but the general timing preference remains. Now, when we get into the later R or reproductive stages, the payback then kind of depends more on the disease present and the severity of that disease. Now, we've seen diseases like tar spot and southern rust, just take down fields in a matter of a week or just a few weeks, to a point where, yields and harvestability have suffered greatly by not applying even a later fungicide application. So, evaluating situations on a field-by-field basis and taking the time to scout still helps us to make the best decision on, whether or not to pull the trigger on a later fungicide application for that corn for grain. Now, with silage corn, we're starting to get within a few weeks of harvest, and there is pre-harvest intervals or PHI labels that, they're going to start to creep into the conversation. Many fungicides have a 2 to 4 week PHI. So, spraying fungicides on silage corn, it's getting harder to justify, both from an ROI perspective and from a pre-harvest timing window perspective. Now, as for soybeans, that R3 growth stage, or what we call that time when you've got a pod of 3/8 inch in length at that fourth node down from the top of the plant. That's the ideal timing for our fungicide application there in soybeans. And, the later we progress past that timing, the less ROI we tend to have. Again, unless we're seeing disease, maybe such as frog eye leaf spot, but remember that a foliar fungicide at any timing, it's not going to cure things like SDS or red crown rot or brown stem rot or even manganese deficiency. So, let's properly identify the problem before we just decide to implement a solution. And as far as managing white mold fungicides, we're way past that timing of window of R1 for white mold. So to wrap up this week's episode, a couple things to remember. First of all, as for heat unit or growing degree day accumulation, we're a little behind last year, but kind of right on track for the 6-year average generally across the area. And Scouting fields now in this critical yield formation time period for both corn and soybeans, boy, that's just essential to wrapping up this crop year successfully and setting up next year's crop for a solid start. We worked so hard to get our crop this far. Please don't just give up on it in the fourth quarter of the game. So, thank you again for tuning in to this week's Golden Harvest Agronomy in Action podcast. Stay patient, stay safe, and I'll see you in the field.